Welcome to Now for Someone Completely Interesting. I'm your host, Ben Poulin. When it comes to this podcast, the format of having interesting people isn't really all that original, but my guests certainly have been. When planning to visit Kimberley, BC this summer for my wife's, well, let's call it her many-year anniversary of her high school graduation reunion, she suggested that I reach out to one of her former high school teachers. What sparked my interest is that Mr. Pugh essentially does what I try to do here, just with a more traditional medium. As a photographer and writer for 2 magazines, he profiles interesting people in the Kootenay region of BC. From a high school teacher and counselor who taught creative writing, he's co-created a Canadian poetry book that had some contributions from several Canadian legends. His 2 sons are delving into some very interesting careers of their own. And there's just some general, what he calls obsessions, or that his friends would call Pewlights. I'm pleased to welcome someone completely interesting, Mr. Jeff Pugh.
Hey, Ben.
I know he said don't go with the Mr. Pugh, but that's how my wife knows you, so we'll start with that. So obviously, I just belched out a lot of interesting facts here that we're going to get into, but if we can start a little bit about, let's get to know you. You're not originally from Kimberley, although you have a deep history here. Let's go to where you're originally from and where you grew up.
Yeah, originally from west side of Vancouver. Spent my formative years there, right in Kerrisdale in Vancouver, and when I was 24, traveled Asia for 8 months, then traveled South America for 6 months, and lived in the Yukon for 4 months. And after my degree in business, I was like, man, I don't know if I want to continue sort of on in business. And so I went back and did a teaching degree, and then moved out to Kimberley when I was 28.
So did you actually seek out to come to Kimberley, or that was the job posting and you jumped on it?
Yeah, that was a good question. That was the job posting. I didn't know Kimberley from Kitimat. I just knew there was a ski hill close by, and being 28, I was just up for an adventure. I thought I'd come out here for a couple of years and then move back to the coast, because I just felt like the West Coast was in my blood, and ended up, the typical story. Getting a job, falling in love, and buying a house and having kids, and that was 31 years ago.
My wife had mentioned, and I don't know if this is true or not, when you first arrived with your teaching job here, you hadn't quite found a place to live. Is it true you lived in a tent on the school?
No, there's many good. No, I lived in a Volkswagen van.
Okay.
I came to Kimberley in a Volkswagen van to keep sort of perspective here. It's Kimberley 1991. It's still a hard rock mining town, so Bavarian town at that time. They're in the 70s and early 80s. They transitioned to a Bavarian town for tourism purposes, because the mine was going to be closing. So it was a really interesting town. It was a tough town. I've written before on Kimberley as this hard rock mining town with, girls had poofy mall bangs and guys had the big belt buckles, and I remember, in the 90s at the high school there being we did a sort of a survey on the kids who didn't feel safe in the school, because there were some tough kids here, and so it's a different town. I came in a Volkswagen van, so I think immediately that sort of set me apart. And I had longer hair, and I slept in the school parking lot. This is a true story for 3 or 4 nights when I first arrived, because my place wasn't ready. I came here in late July. Police came by at 3 o'clock in the morning and shined the light in, and I said, I'm a high school teacher here, and they just laughed and let me sort of sleep there. But that was quite something. Yeah.
What drew you to creative writing as your what would you call it? I guess your teaching background for.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I was in business, commerce degree at UBC. My dad was an accountant, and we lived in a fairly affluent neighborhood, and that's kind of all I knew and thought what I would do. And then 2 years through a business degree, I went to the counselor and said, I'm really not enjoying this, and I didn't think I was going to finish an accounting degree there. And she said, try marketing. So I did that. I really, loved it. It was really fun to study. But like I said, then I went away to Asia and had this thought of I need to seek deeper purpose, which was ironic now because all my friends in business have really meaningful lives and are really wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I came here and I was teaching business for 4 years. So I would have taught Monique and that crew sort of business education, accounting, marketing, things like
Okay.
that. But I always knew I was kind of searching for something out of the business field. So I did my counseling master's, and then when I came back from doing that, I started teaching English as just one subject here and there, like English 10 or English 9. I just slowly got into the sort of creative aspect of it. I started teaching a course called Creative Writing 12 that I started, and I was away on a trip to Banff for a writers' festival with a group of kids, and one of the mothers, Judy Winter, said, what do you write? And I said, I don't. I just teach creative writing. She's like, how can you teach creative writing if you don't write? So at that point I said, yeah, you're kind of right. So I just started sort of fooling around, writing a bit, and eventually got into sort of poetry and some magazine writing, things like that.
Going back to your teaching days, you
Yeah.
taught 25 years. You said you taught. Here
I've taught 31 in total now,
Okay.
but yeah.
What are some of your favorite moments or memories that come up from those years?
Oh man, let's see. What are ones I can tell? Which ones I can't? It's just like I said. When I think about education over the last 30 years, and I know you've spoken to teachers on this podcast before. Like, yeah, times have just changed, and I think in the first few years of coming in and sneaking cigarettes in the storage room with the principal, things like that, right? And a teacher walking in the next day and saying someone's been smoking, and we were like, well, that was the principal and I, and stuff like that. So I just think of
You didn't throw a student under the bus?
No. I just think of times have changed so much. Now they talk about helicopter parenting. They talk about sort of the different role teachers play in kids' lives, just with things like over the last 10 years, since for many reasons, but one of them being smartphones and social media, just the increase in depression and anxiety and hospitalization. So times have just changed. So I'm just trying to think if I have any great anecdotes. I probably could pull some out, but I think some have come from the creative writing class. It's such a non-traditional class. We've been to Banff and Calgary for the writers' festivals, and there's been some crazy things happening there, and that's always been some interesting sort of times. Once a author came up at 11 o'clock at night, and all my students, probably had about 20 students and about 3 parents spread throughout the theater. 11 o'clock at night, the sixth and final poet said, dim lights, roll film. And he read from a book that he'd written called The Pornographer's Poem, and he read about 15 minutes from this book while he showed some pretty inappropriate for high school students film, basically pornography. And
Right.
the lights came on. I had the bus driver say, I'm 43 years old and I had to go on a creative writing trip to watch pornography, and my head was in my hands, and a parent was consoling me because it was devastating. I couldn't gather the kids; they were all spread out, and we wrote letters of sort of protests and stuff. But those kind of stories are I think rare, but certainly colorful. Yeah, on Monday I went to the principal. I said, "You won't believe what happened at the Writers' Festival on the weekend." And he was like, "No, tell me that's not true." I said, "It's true, but yeah."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rolling the dice, I guess. Okay, you mentioned got into poetry. There's a book you're involved with I want to talk about in just a little bit here, but I do want to get into there's a couple magazines you've been writing for, and that's what kind of actually piqued my interest, is how you got into doing these articles that you've photographed portraits, and written articles about some interesting and even prominent people in the Kootenay area. What drew you to that?
Yeah, good question. I think a couple things. One was just this interest that I had in writing and certainly in poetry. So I got into poetry in around sort of early 2000s. Started writing poetry, started getting into a bit of publication, sort of with some poetry journals, and eventually this book. And I always just thought of my fascination, like yourself, with interesting people, and the interest comes in so many different forms. And they always say the sort of to live an artist's life, you don't necessarily have to practice being an artist. You just have to practice paying attention and noticing things that other people maybe don't notice. So I've always just had such a fascination with people. And so there's these two publications, sort of prominent publications in the Kootenays. One's called Kootenay Mountain Culture out of Nelson. Really slick publication. They print 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 copies that go out throughout sort of the northern western states and through BC and Alberta. And then what at the time was called Go Kimberley, which was a local magazine, but again, really, really nice magazine based on sort of just Kimberley. And then it expanded to Cranbrook. And now they're sort of in a new magazine called Go Cranberley, soon to be, or potentially to be renamed into something more representative of the Rocky Mountain Trench area. So I just started, I think I pitched an idea about Margie Jameson, I think it was my first article, who's just this legend in the Kootenays, and wrote that, and the publisher was really happy with it and said, I'll sort of publish anything you write sort of in the style about people. And then I started doing the same thing with the Kootenay Mountain Culture. I think the first piece I wrote for them was on sort of 4 people in the Kootenays who faced fear differently than we did. So a fellow who had the biggest world record for jumping off the cliff on his skis, and then a refugee from Burma who had no arms or legs, who was just this incredible person, somebody who'd been attacked by a bear and survived. And so just this sort of fascination with people that got me into writing. How about, let me turn the tables. How about you?
You're not allowed to.
What's your, come on. What's been your interest?
Well, okay. So you mentioned, how did you word it? You don't have to be, you don't have to practice art to be the artist. I don't see myself that way, but definitely maybe I could say art appreciation, like how I can't play or sing any kind of musical instrument. I have no sense of tone, but I have a big appreciation of music. Like I can listen to just about anything and everything, and the stories people share as to what and I just what I was going to ask you next, though, before you turn the tables, was do people find you, or do you find the people for your articles?
Sometimes they find me. Sometimes it'll be a person contact me, often through social media, saying, hey, my grandfather, was one of the first, fill in the blank. Would you be interested in doing a story on him or her, that sort of thing. And then sometimes it'll just be like I was telling you before we rolled the mics, just sometimes it'll be me and being in a bar, seeing a guy with a toothpick going and talking to him, and eventually, thinking he ordered the chicken wings and he's going to take a toothpick out of his mouth, but he's, an hour later still with a toothpick in his mouth, and I start talking about this toothpick, and he's like, yeah, man, I go have a toothpick in my mouth 8 hours a day, and I'm like, I started thinking, and it ended up, writing an article about this cool dude who, has a toothpick in his mouth. And it wasn't until my son the next day at a Chinese restaurant at the end of our meal grabbed a toothpick out of the sort of by the cashier and put it in his mouth and squinted in the sun as he walked outside, because he'd met the same fellow on the street. And I just saw that connection, thought, I want to see if he wants an article done about him. So sometimes me sort of encountering people, and then sometimes it's the publisher will say, hey, do you want to write an article on this person? And then often it'll be people reaching out.
Have you ever had trouble coaxing people to
I have. There are 2 sort of Kimberley legends who I've approached. One who is an ex high school teacher at Selkirk, a fellow named Blake Rawson, who is 75 today, and who is the most in shape sort of mountain man you'll ever. And I just thought a story on him would be really interesting, but he's too humble. And another was a friend of mine who lives up the St. Mary's Valley, who's just the quintessential dirtbag, and it would make a really interesting story. But I haven't got him. But yeah,
I've had 2 turn me down cold continually. One is my father-in-law. Yeah. Will not come on. He's written down his memoirs.
What a story.
I know.
Gets, yeah.
There's a ton of them, and the best way to hear them is from his own mouth. The other one was another teacher at the high school that you taught at Selkirk High School in Kimberley, was Mr. Johnson.
Oh, right. Oh my goodness.
He's a great sense of humor,
Yeah.
lots of great stories, but just this. I asked him, and he says, "It's just not my cup of tea."
No,
with,
yeah.
with his British accent, of course.
Sure,
but-
yeah, absolutely. Would have a repertoire of jokes like
Yeah,
I'm sure you heard.
Yeah.
You wouldn't believe that.
Yeah. Talk about off color sometimes.
Yeah.
The old elbow from his wife wouldn't stop.
Yeah, and I think and I'm sure you've come across this too, is like people have a different reaction to be the center of attention.
Yeah.
Sometimes their humility is so high that they can't see an interesting story in themselves, and often I'll say to them, we'll find it, probably like you do somewhat. And I like how you go into this, fairly unscripted, unrehearsed, which I do as well. When I go and talk to people, I rarely have questions. But my background's in counseling, so I'll just kind of like you're doing, segue through, different topics and of interest and things, right?
I've said it for myself because my background's radio. I got out of that business and I miss it. So doing this is, it kind of gets me back into that. But I've even had other guests share the same feeling that I always say, this is cheaper than therapy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes, just being relaxed and calm. It's like a get to know someone.
Yeah.
And we're sitting across the table. These microphones tend to put a little bit of an intimidation factor for some people, but once you forget it's there, and the stories start flowing, and that to me is where the gold is.
Yeah, and I think similar to what you do, I always tell people there's no dirt here. This is not an expose. This is kind of celebrate. I always say this is celebrating you and your role in this community. And I always show them the draft before it goes to the publisher, which a lot of writers don't do, or a lot of photographers don't do that as well. But I don't want anybody to be I don't say disappointed. I want them to feel good about the piece, because that's my intention of going in. And I've had some people who have said it's kind of been a life-changing event for a number of reasons. But one fellow in particular ended up being on the cover, and is such a just wonderful Kimberley sort of persona and celebrity in his own right, that he just talked about sort of the impact that cover article sort of had on his life and stuff like that.
I'm stealing that line from you to explain how I want to portray. I don't want to dig up dirt, but I do want to celebrate what people have to offer.
Yeah,
because everybody's got great stories. Everybody's done something neat.
Yeah,
and just getting to the point of that sometimes is where most of the fun is too.
Mm-hmm.
And it always leads to something else.
Yeah, it's like they say, what's the line? Something like, leave two people trapped in an elevator long enough, a story will develop, right? And I think the same thing with people is, when we talk about Satir's iceberg, we talk about the top 10% being above water, and that's what are you wearing? What are you? What are those physical expressions we see? But you go the deeper and deeper you go, the more great stories about their values and personal experiences they've had, right?
Yeah. So you mentioned 30 plus years in Kimberley here. You have two sons that, as I mentioned in the intro, are delving into what I would deem some very interesting careers. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, my youngest son just finished his poli-sci degree, and he's looking at either a master's or maybe law. But he's into film, analog photography, and just does these beautiful sort of pieces. Some I have on my wall, and he might want to pursue that, on a semi-professional level. And my older son, is in New York, and he's a commercial filmmaker, and he just makes these beautiful, beautiful sort of short films. He was nominated, I'm trying to think, it was 2 or 3 years back, for the Cannes Film Festival. Right. He was one of 3 North Americans, the only Canadian for the Best Young Director Award. So he went to the Cannes Film Festival for that, and he right now is working on a flyover Chicago project where he's doing the 7-minute ground portion of this basically huge, pretty big project in Chicago for tourism. And he just loves sort of doing the same thing we're doing, talking to people and getting their story and stuff like that.
Guess he gets it from you then.
I think I'm not. He comes from a lot of creative background. Yeah.
Okay. What are the obsessions you have that you talked about?
Yeah, like
people,
on my 40th birthday.
And why are they called pew lights?
Well, a friend of mine coined that term. He talks about 6 weeks obsessions, and when for my 40th birthday party, he did a sort of a poem, a sort of narrative about different Pulites. And at the time, he was like, "Hey, I'm going to start jogging for basically 6 weeks, and I'm going to stop by the creek in the morning and have a little sip of water as I'm jogging." And they're my obsessions that some last longer than others, like writing and photography and teaching, but some are just real quick obsessions. I got into flute making for quite a while, and then bamboo flute making, and then haven't done that in probably 4 or 5 years.
You'd be the second flute maker I've had on this show.
Yeah, so I just get obsessed, and I think it's again about two things: probably a little bit of ADHD, but also just sort of this zest for life, and something grabs my attention, whether it's a person or a process or something like that, or a thing, and I just get really obsessed with it. And then sometimes like life, the waves come in and the waves go out, and I become sort of less interested, but there's still the echoes of it, I guess, too, right?
Okay, there was an attention grabber when you sent me some topics to throw at you here on the table. So, and one of them is a book that you have with you. And you dropped some pretty heavy legendary names when you were talking about it. So I'll just actually let you take over and explain this project.
So I've been involved in two poetry books, two poetry projects. One is one of my own writing, which is called One Foot In, which I can read a poem from.
Sure.
Poem. And the one before that was a poetry book called Radiant Dance of Being, a poetic portrait of Bill Bissett. And Bill Bissett is often referred to as the grandfather not the mob boss of Canadian poetry, but I'm trying to remember. But he's such a legend in Canadian poetry.
Right.
He, in the 60s and 70s, Kerouac said, was asked in the Paris Review, who's the most interesting writer out there, and he said Bill Bissett. So he's just this remarkable artist. He's a painter. He's still a working poet. That's how he survived on his art all his life. He was born in 1939, so he's been around a long time. And he came to Kimberley. I put on an event called Poetry on the Rocks for a number of years, which was a poetry event in Cranbrook and Kimberley. And he came from Toronto for that. And I just kind of fell in love with this really unique human being. Just people just fall in love with Bill Bissett. He's such a character. So when he left, I found I'd written this poem called about when Bill Bissett blows into town, just like the town changes, and then when he leaves, the town changes as well. So I wrote this poem that eventually ended up in the buses in Vancouver as part of their BC sort of Poets in Transit, which was kind of fun. But I wrote this poem, left it on the fridge, and just got thinking there must be other people who've written poems about Bill Bissett. So I contacted a friend of mine in the States who's another writer, poet, Steve Roxborough, and we kind of dreamed up this idea of this celebration about Bill Bissett through poetry, which is done. It's certainly not the first time that's ever been done, but it was the first time it had been done for Bill, but in this scale. So after a couple of years on working on this project, we had 87 Canadian poets write love poems for Bill Bissett. So there was Margaret Atwood on Christmas morning. A poem came in from Margaret Atwood, and she also wrote an anecdote about Bill being her astral twin. There was a poem that came in from Mount Baldy from Leonard Cohen, who wrote a short poem about Bill. So there was just these huge sort of Canadian names in poetry, and I was going to say at that time and now pretty unknown names sort of in Canadian poetry. So it was such an honor for us to work on something for Bill, and have these poets trust us that it was going to turn out. So it turned out to be this beautiful collection. We toured Vancouver, Victoria, Calgary, Toronto with launches, and it was just it turned out to be this beautiful sort of book celebrating Bill Bissett. And then the other one is this book of sort of personal poems that I wrote called One Foot In.
All right, and you said you could read something from that. What in particular, like, are these poems that you've been writing since? Because you said you started playing around with writing back when you were in your early days of teaching, or and started your creative writing class, or this was a collection of poems, sort of that I'd written probably over about a 4-year period.
Okay, and a friend I know was a poetry editor on the coast, knew a publisher, and made that connection, and they just did a beautiful job doing this book. The designer was from Vegas and did this great cover with a looks like an X-ray of a foot with a fly stuck through the toe, because I almost died at one time with a brain aneurysm, so it was a reference to that, and with the shape of a heart in the line there. So it was quite a lovely design, but it turned out to be
We'll have to get a picture. Actually, no, it's on your website.
It is. Yeah,
we'll talk about that towards the end here. But yeah,
but I'll read one if you want, just to give you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and this poem was selected in the Kootenay-Columbia area for a representation of the Kootenay-Columbia area for a collection of Canadian poems from the poet laureate at the time, a number of years back. So that was kind of fun.
Cool.
And it's called River Lore. River Lore. I wander through rivers, stumble over rocks, tiptoe between the certainty of log jams and the grizzly bear hidden behind the bush. I fling a thin line into the current, a tiny hook disguised as a fly, moth, beetle, the succulent deception of its blue-green belly. I've got better things to do than drag these fish to my knees, cradle them in my palm, twist hooks from pierced lips. Yet who can trust the tyranny of evolution? Before I return fish to water, I cast a stern stare. I say, this is a scrap of foam, this a dry feather rejected by a peacock. Let the hook's glint be your beacon. Let it remind you of the cruelty of pointy things. I'm teaching you a lesson, how to become a better fish.
Wow.
Fun. Yeah. Fun. Yeah.
That's cool. Actually, no, it's funny the way you describe it. There's a creek just down the hill from us that just kind of, the image pops in.
Yeah, Mark Creek.
Yeah.
Which now have fish in them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, no, it's, that's a first here. We've had people sing, but we've never had poetry, original poetry.
All right. Yeah.
So congratulations on setting another Poulin Radio record.
Yeah. No. Thanks. Yeah. It was. It was a fun book. Both books were super fun to work on. We did CBC work with it, sort of interviews, and on Cheryl McKay's North by Northwest, and like I said, toured with them, and it was pretty fun.
Thanks very much for sharing that. I appreciate it.
No, fun.
You made another. I guess it was a little subtle comment, but you did text me about having some very excessively wealthy friends.
Yes, yeah. No,
you use the word Illuminati.
Yeah, no. Well, when I think of when I think of my life, like I said, I did a business degree, and then I went into teaching, and some friends just stayed the course in business, and I'm just I think how just lucky I am with a couple of friends, but one in particular is generous beyond sort of any reasonable expectations. We go to Arizona for a trip once or twice a year, and he's got 2 Ferraris. He's got Kim Kardashian's Porsche he bought, Bentleys, and he's got about 8 cars, and he'll just say to me, "Hey, I want to take someone out for a spin." So I'll sometimes on social media post these videos of me driving a Ferrari but getting stuck in reverse on a street, not knowing how to turn around, and he gets a kick out of that. And we go salmon fishing twice a year, and he lives in a hotel in downtown Vancouver, right on the water. He's got a loft with, again, more cars, and he's incredibly generous, and with students who've graduated from Selkirk. Sometimes he's helped out. There's a tough story that I tell him about. He's once a young gal graduated, and she had a tough life. Came to Selkirk in grade 10, just piss and vinegar, just spitting nails. She was so angry at everybody, and by the time she turned around in grade 12, she was this remarkable, kind young lady, and it was such a turnaround. She had a tough tale to her life, sort of thing. And I asked her, I said, what turned you around? And she said, at one time I just woke up, I was tired of being angry all the time, and I said, I'm going to be nice, and I was nice that day, and someone was really nice back, and then she expanded it. But so by the time she'd graduated, she was this kid that everybody adored. And I just told my friend this story, and he was, and because we were going to award her this Pat Harrington Award, who was the principal when Monique was here, and my friend said, I'll match that. So he sent 24 $50 bills for her in an envelope, and we called her into the counseling area, and there I think there's about 10 staff members there, and we FaceTimed him, and he just said, "Hey Sam, I just wanted to let you know I'm so proud of you. Jeff's told me your story," and stuff like that, and one friend had bought her a beautiful longboard through the shop here, the local Kimberley skateboard place, which was great. And then the other friend had given this envelope of 24 $50 bills, and she just broke down in tears and stuff like that. So all the kids at school, my creative writing class, if we're doing fundraisers, we often contact Bruce for a donation so we can win the pizza party. And so he's a bit of a legend in Kimberley. Bruce Coleman. Shout out for Bruce Coleman.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And well, there you go. Another great story to share from your days as a teacher as well.
Yeah.
Is he someone you've known like since childhood?
We've known. Yeah, he called us once when his parents were away, and I think it was in grade 9 or 10, and he thought he had someone breaking into the place, so 3 of us went over with baseball bats and slept over, and so it's that sort of long friendship.
Right.
Our first sort of time on a grad trip, our girlfriends went and we all split a hotel room, and we just, as they were in the bathroom getting ready, we were just giggling, feeling like we're like businessmen. It's incredible. We're like, here we are. And so yeah, we go back a long way. We've got a good group of friends.
Well, what good is all that money if you don't have good friends to share it with then?
Exactly. Yeah. Every rich person should hear that.
Yeah. There you go. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing these stories and sitting in with this. 30 minutes goes by fast. I told you it would.
Sure does, yeah.
Last question.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many of these you've listened to. I know you listened to 1 or 2 for sure, but this is the one and only question I ask every single guest.
Yep.
And this may be a tough one for you, or maybe not. But you're here as someone completely interesting, who I think is completely interesting. But I would like to know if you were to pick someone for this podcast. They don't have to come on, but someone you think that their story deserves to be heard. Who would that be?
Yeah, I would. I'm going to go back to Blake Rawson and John Hayner and local Kimberley people. And as I mentioned, John Hayner is this friend who lives up St. Mary's Valley, and he designed this house that is part miracle, part disaster, but it's beautiful. It looks like it's been there 100 years, and it's just we still do actually have a film festival called the Dirtbag Film Festival, Festival, and celebrating sort of local dirtbag culture. It had a few years hiatus, but it's back again. And he was the Kimberley dirtbag, like the icon for a number of years. They made films about him, and
right.
And so he's such a character. I would say, find John Hayner. Yeah.
Would he agree to do it?
You know what? He just might. Okay. He just might.
Okay. Yeah. We'll see. Once again, here, my guest is Mr. Pugh, Jeff Pugh. Your website, www.jeffpugh.com. That's JEFFPEW.com.
Yeah.
You also have Instagram as well, where you post a lot of great stuff like this. And I just want to thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Hey, Ben, thanks. That was super fun.
It was exciting. So once again, if you've enjoyed this podcast, you can find us on social media by searching out Poulin Radio, and through your favorite podcast provider. Search Poulin Radio, or now for someone completely interesting. If you give us a like and subscribe, you'll be sure that you never miss an episode. So once again, my guest, Jeff Pugh. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben.